I trust dogs. Dogs are good boys. That's a fundamental, almost biological truth we've all agreed on. That is, right up until the moment a Norwegian helicopter starts shooting thermite grenades at one in the middle of a South Pole research station. Then, all bets are off. There are many people who would label John Carpenter's 1982 chiller The Thing as the greatest horror film ever made. And I certainly think a case can be made for that. It's the cinematic equivalent of feeling a boa constrictor slowly tighten your arms and chest in its grip, feeling the air involuntarily get pressed out of your lungs as you gasp for breath. But The Thing is more than just a creature feature to be comfortably filed in the drawer next to Alien and Sharknado. If one looks closer, the monster is more than just a space alien with a penchant for high-concept taxidermy. The monster is the dissolution of reality itself. This video contains spoilers, so consider watching the film first before you continue. And if you like what you see, click the like button, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and make sure to click the little bell to be notified for new videos. John Carpenter's The Thing follows a group of American researchers at a desolate Antarctic station whose routine isolation is shattered by the arrival of a parasitic extraterrestrial life form. Unlike a typical movie monster that hunts from the shadows, this entity is a master of perfect imitation, capable of absorbing any organic being and replicating its appearance, voice, and memories down to the cellular level. As the crew realizes the creature could be anyone, their pilot, their doctor, or even the base commander, the mission devolves from scientific research into a claustrophobic nightmare of paranoia.
I said, watch Clark.
The film serves as the ultimate whodunit, with the stakes being the biological erasure of humanity, framed against a frozen landscape where trust is a luxury no one can afford.
Why don't you just trust in the Lord?
From the first moment that Norwegian dog shows up to the incredibly bleak ending, The Thing is a masterpiece. It goes beyond being a scary movie. It's an exploration into how everything falls apart when we can't explain the world anymore. It shows what happens when trust and logic just vanish, leaving everyone lost in a void where being human doesn't seem to mean anything.
I don't know who to trust. Trust's a tough thing to come by these days.
And if we're truly going to understand what John Carpenter is telling us, beyond Kurt Russell can grow a magnificent beard, we have to know about the concepts that his film is attacking. And to do that, I want to stand on the shoulders of the giants of critical theory to ask, how do we know what we know? What is the nature of our existence? And if we can't answer those first two, what happens to us? The answers to those questions begin not in an isolated research station, but 300 years ago in Western Europe, where thinkers like John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that science and philosophy should be used to improve human life, rather than just support old political or religious rules. And so the Enlightenment kicked off, and suddenly the finest minds in the Western world were all about ourselves. We started contemplating space, biology, and the human condition, all with the hope of making life better for everyone. From their perspective, people are happier when they aren't dying of random diseases. And maybe most importantly to those in power, people are less likely to use the guillotine if they have a say in their government. And during that time came an unprecedented explosion in the exploration of the natural world, the curing of diseases, the rise of new economic systems geared toward recognizing the value of the individual. This movement was centered on rationalism, the idea that intellect and logic were much better at telling us what's actually real than our own potentially faulty senses. The movement was so effective that it eventually became untouchable and above criticism. There was a swagger among scientists that if we can just identify the problems, study them, and experiment on them, we can solve them. Society would continue to progress, not just intellectually, but morally as well. With more people studying philosophy and greater access to public education, people would turn away from the old superstitions that led them into darkness, and they would create a better world. Even though this way of thinking was dominant through the early 20th century, it wasn't monolithic. There were critics who were largely kept to the fringes of power and discourse. The Enlightenment had major contradictions. It promoted ideas like human freedom and individual rights. Yet these same countries that led the movement also kept people as slaves and invaded other nations. This period was also a key part of creating modern ideas about race and racial superiority, providing a moral and scientific reason for slavery and oppression. The rise of fascism should not have been possible in Weimar Germany. Weimar was arguably the most highly educated and liberal society in Western history, boasting the most prestigious universities and a constitution that focused on civil liberties. And yet, despite the intellectual and moral superiority of liberal democracy, the Republic collapsed into fascism in less than a generation. In response to Hitler's rise, an arms race began as countries raced to build the world's first atomic weapon. The race, of course, was won by the United States of America, which promptly used the new technology to end the war and kick off a new world order. One in which, for the first time in human history, humanity wielded the power to destroy itself. To be clear, none of this should have happened according to the theories of the Enlightenment. Negotiation and conflict resolution should have been enough to prevent a world war, let alone a second one. The legal and political systems should have been enough to prevent the rise of a brutal dictator. Rational thought should have prevented us from inventing something that could wipe us all out. Instead, not only did science and reason not prevent these things, they were the catalyst. This criticism is at the heart of Christian Nyby's 1951 adaptation of the John W. Campbell novella, Who Goes There?, which we know as The Thing from Another World. Despite their common ancestor, Nyby's film is the polar opposite of Carpenter's, with his expedition literally taking place at the North Pole instead of the South. But the differences are not just geographical, they're also ideological. Nyby's film follows a bunch of no-nonsense army men, led by square-jawed buckaroo Kenneth Tobey, as they travel to a scientific research station to babysit a bunch of scientists who may have discovered a crashed Russian satellite. Of course, it turns out not to be a Russian satellite at all.
We finally got one. We found a flying saucer.
Just a big frozen disc under the ice, with a big frozen guy next to the big frozen disc.
Must be over 8 feet long. Somebody got out of that saucer.
Got out or was thrown up.
Despite blowing up the saucer, the army is able to bring back this massive being still frozen in a block of ice. One of the guards, who is spooked to the point of daffiness, tosses a blanket onto the block, not realizing that it's an electric blanket. The thing thaws out and goes on a rampage, triggering a then very pertinent question: do we let the scientists study this thing and perhaps advance the cause of biological and natural sciences, or do we let the army mow it down and save the world? Now, even if you count yourself as apolitical, how you answer this question reveals a lot about how you see the world. There really is no way to be above politics about this. And it's crystal clear now how Nyby, or let's face it, Howard Hawks, saw the world at the time. Taking place a mere 6 years after the death of Adolf Hitler and the dropping of bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, The Thing from Another World posits that the egghead thinkers of the world got us into this mess. And while they were puzzling their way through the morality of Hitler's fascism, the world was falling into disarray. It took good old-fashioned American gumption to pull us back from the brink, and that started with a reactionary view of good and evil, not an analytical one. For the Army, and for post-war America in the 1950s, the answers were easy. We are the good guys, and whatever we're doing is a good thing. Whatever Hitler was doing was a bad thing, and you better fall in line or get out of the way. There's a certain comfort in that simplicity. It's cleaner. And in the case of World War II, it had the added benefit of being accurate. And so Nyby's army men, who paternalistically treat the grown-ass scientists like children, save the day. In spite of the lead scientist standing in front of the creature like a bookworm version of Neville Chamberlain, offering peace and understanding to James Arness's grunting Hitler carrot. The thing is destroyed because the scientist acquiesced and listened to the military, and we're left with a warning to look to the skies, because there may be more of them. Because there's always more of them. In John Carpenter's The Thing, The monster's greatest weapon is its ability to mimic a familiar face. It turns the image of a friend into a trap. Imagine you're at a dinner party and two people get into a fight. It gets really heated, but you realize the thing that they're arguing over is just a word, or rather, the meaning of a word. Both arguers are using the same language, the same words, but their interpretation of reality is vastly different. If you think about the mechanics of what's going on, you are expelling air from your lungs and vibrating some little flaps in your throat to produce a sound wave that travels through the air, reverberating off the other person's eardrum and planting an idea in their brain, often against their will.
Eyelash mites.
We tend to think of language as a natural phenomenon, like words are just sticky notes we affix to a thing in the world. But language is actually architecture. It's a complex structure we invented to lay our system of meaning over the natural world. Well after the start of the Enlightenment, but before World War I, Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure contributed a fascinating idea that both advanced the Enlightenment's ideals and poked holes in them. A word, or any kind of signifier, has no direct relation to the thing it represents, which is why the table this microphone is attached to can also be called la mesa, or la table. But after a while, once you've seen it enough, the sign and the idea it refers to just sort of fuse together in your head. And that kind of mental shortcut can be dangerous when you don't think about it critically. Carpenter's creature is a wrench in the whole system of meaning. It's a blank slate that just eats and copies what something looks like, but skips over the actual history and the heart of the original. When that Norwegian dog shows up at Outpost 31, it's the sign as a trap. It looks exactly like a scared, harmless animal looking for help from a guy who's clearly lost his mind. And let's be honest, the guys at the Outpost can relate to someone going a little stir-crazy. It's easy to look at that and just see a lonely guy in the snow finally snapping and turning on his best friend. Who is not fooled are the real dogs, who don't rely on the signifiers in the same way that we do. Without the culturally conditioned assumptions that we have, they immediately recognize this counterfeit. The screenplay describes the dog as unnaturally still, his eyes dead, lusterless black spheres. For the biological dogs, the thing in front of them doesn't represent a dog. They immediately sense that the newcomer is just a predator in disguise. To understand this, you have to bring in Roland Barthes, who took these signs one step further. For Barthes, the signs weren't just disconnected bits of information. When you stack them on top of one another, they form myths about the world. Budweiser doesn't sell beer in their commercials. In fact, the product is barely mentioned. What we see instead are Clydesdales, sunsets, prairie land, all things that spell a simple, strong, no-nonsense America. Budweiser is selling America. And if you're a true American, you'll drink the beer. In Western mythos, the dog doesn't just represent a biological Canis lupus familiaris. It signifies loyalty, domesticity, safety, and subservience to humanity. The Thing weaponizes these Barthesian myths, using the comforting cultural associations of the dog to bypass common sense defenses. Now that the organic, biological, natural link between signifier and signified has been severed, the whole world is untrustworthy. And what good is your rationality and empiricism then? Blair discovers that the creature in Carpenter's The Thing is actually made up of billions of individual cells, each with its own survival instinct and capacity to imitate biological forms. When the thing has to move quickly, as in the case of Bennings, its rushed mimicry is incomplete. But when it has time, the illusion is nearly imperceptible.
How long have they been out there? 40, 45 minutes.
In the meantime, the thing is devouring you cell by cell.
Blair?
And as much as it would suck to be devoured on the molecular level by the thing, at the end, it would be like every other human death. You simply cease to exist, right?
There's still cellular activity in these burned remains. They're not dead yet.
The real horror is the antemortem, the period before death. In Carpenter's film, that's the time when you don't know if the person next to you is biding his time, waiting to reveal himself as the alien creature. Worse yet, there has to be a period of time in between when the thing first infects someone and when they start to realize they're being assimilated. I mean, there has to be a liminal period there, right? Just like with a cold. You've been getting sick for a long time before you actually start feeling sick. In that period of time, are you an alien in a human form? Or are you a human with a little bit of alien in them? At what point do you make the switch? And do you feel it coming? Western thought is structured around dichotomies. Things are defined by what they are not. Human alien, self-other, inside-outside, mind-body, presence-absence, and original copy are all ways that we think about the world. In all of these dichotomies, the first term is inherently privileged. It's the center one, it's the correct one. The second term is derivative. It's somehow a corruption or a threat to the first one. It's a trace. The second term is defined by what the first term is not. This kind of thinking forms the basis of our own worst prejudices. But it also allows us to function. If we had to use algebraic thinking for everything, we'd be cooked. The this or that mentality boils the world down into two options, and one of them is bad. Always. That kind of thinking is frequently inaccurate, but it is efficient. The easiest example of this is the Netflix show Is It Cake?, where the artist/baker contestants try to fool the judges as to whether something is the real thing or if it's just an incredibly detailed and realistic cake. It works on a very simple but accurate premise that everything in the world can be categorized as cake or not cake. The trick is that the cake looks like not cake things, which messes with your perception of the world. The hand is simultaneously a hand and a cake, and not a hand and a cake until you cut into it. In this case, the cake is not the lie. The cake is the truth, hiding in some other form. French philosopher Jacques Derrida wrote about the quasi-tongue-in-cheek idea of différance. It's a term that is intentionally slippery. Derrida thought that things were defined by what they were not. The cake is a cake because it is not a basketball, or a hand, or a typewriter. In other words, it differs from those things. But Derrida also said that meaning is never fully present in a word. When you look up a word in the dictionary, you just get more words. And when you look up those, you get even more words. It's an endless rabbit hole of signifiers. You never arrive at the fixed, ultimate truth, only a constantly deferred meaning that exists at some future point. And that's the second half of the play on words. The meaning between two things differs, and that meaning is also deferred to the future. So what if the alien only attacked and replicated dogs? And in 27,000 hours or whatever it is, it replicated every dog on the planet, with the difference being that it didn't affect any other species, or change the behavior of the dog. It infected the dog, took over the dog, became indistinguishable from the dog, and took the dog's place in society as a pet, guardian, or faithful companion. Isn't that just a dog? Even if its cellular structure came from another planet and replicated our terrestrial dogs down to the molecule, isn't that still just a dog at that point? What if you weren't even aware of the alien's replication of the dog? What if it happened in secret, when you weren't looking? The dog is the same dog as far as you're concerned. And if you think about that, how do you know that that didn't happen?
Now that's a thought that's going to fester.
The truth, reality, is constantly being deferred. And until the cutting of the cake happens, reality is always a future promise, not a present condition. And to really drive home his point, because post-structuralist philosophers are all basically internet trolls with better drug habits, Derrida spelled his différance with an A to differentiate between différance and différance. But the gag is they're pronounced the same, so there's no way of knowing which one is being used until you see it written out on paper. The Thing similarly takes a hammer to these binaries, making them irrelevant. This is true of both of the film itself and the creature at the heart of it. The film was a flop, barely making back its production budget. But the ensuing 40-plus years have seen it become one of the most highly praised horror films of all time. The meaning of what the film is shifted. And is shifting. Constantly. We understand and appreciate the Thing differently after we've seen its 2011 prequel. As for the alien creature, for Derrida, a subject can only be defined by the trace of what it is not. If we saw Bennings and the alien side by side in its original form, we'd be able to say that Bennings is not the alien in the same way that we know that square-jawed buckaroo Kenneth Tobey is not giant carrot James Arness. We'd also be able to say that the alien is not Bennings. But that's not how this alien works. The monster is the transition from one to another. When the alien is physically and cellularly indistinguishable from the human, the boundary that defines the self crumbles. Unlike the creature in Nibby's film, Carpenter's Thing is not a foreign invader putting the outpost under siege. It's an internal infection that erases the line between the self and the other. And it creates a ticking time bomb inside its victim. The movie is the equivalent of Derrida's différance, where meaning is constantly suspended. The Thing is always in a perpetual state of becoming, never settling into a fixed, stable identity. The thing slips away the moment you try to stabilize its meaning. This is most apparent when the thing assimilates Bennings. As Macready and Childs witness the creature absorbing him, the physical boundaries of Bennings' human body dissolve. Yes, we recoil from the gore, but the terror comes from watching the boundary between human and alien be erased before our very eyes. When Macready finds the shredded long johns left behind, he reasons that the thing can imitate flesh, but it can't imitate inorganic material. That leaves clothing as the only stable signifier, the last desperate marker of the human versus alien binary. But of course, clothing can be stolen, hidden, and framed, making it so easy to manipulate the group's grasp of the truth. So every time you think that you've found a stable signifier, it gets used against you. The human form is now meaningless. A question. What does the thing really look like? We know that it exists, and that it is a thing that is unique and differentiated from both dogs and humans. But what is its true form? Carpenter's creature is a copy that has no original, at least as far as we can tell. It's just a series of flesh strands and sinew. If it does have an original, that original has been so perfectly replaced that the distinction between the real and the artificial no longer matters. In the role of Jean Baudrillard, simulations and copies become so common that they overwhelm and replace reality, which gives rise to what he called hyperreality. This is a state where something real is indistinguishable from the fake, where a symbol comes first and then we mold our understanding of reality around that. If Derrida was a surgeon carefully picking apart a text to show that it's held together by spit and sealing wax, Baudrillard is the guy telling you that the text was never alive to begin with. It would be like discovering that there is no lake where the map said that there should be one. So you expend massive amounts of blood and treasure to build the lake so that the map and reality are in harmony with one another. In that view of the world, the map is more true than the physical reality. So the physical reality must change. But if we do nothing to keep altering our reality to match the map, what happens when reality can't be mapped? To carry over the is it cake metaphor, we'd just be eating the basketball and gleefully not knowing the difference. In the frozen, inescapable isolation of the Antarctic, the characters are trapped in a literal desert of the real, a world where everything is potentially just a representation of reality, so they can no longer verify the authenticity of their own companions, or even themselves. Blair, the Outpost senior biologist, explains the nature of the threat exactly. The entity doesn't just wear a disguise, it becomes a perfect replica. It's a model of the real, without origin or reality. Baudrillard says when meaning collapses in the face of hyperreality, society often attempts to manufacture artificial proofs of the real to stave off that terror of meaninglessness. Macready's blood test is the ultimate attempt to resuscitate reality. Macready rightly theorizes that, unlike humans, the blood of the thing cannot be separated from its host. Or rather, the blood is its own host. The blood is its own independent, survival-driven organism. So when Macready threatens it with a hot wire, he's attempting to get the simulacrum, the floating symbol, to reveal its artificiality. What he actually reveals is the system of signs itself has been hijacked. The men are trapped in a loop, where any indication of reality is just a mirage, standing in for an unlocatable, absent truth. Derrida and Baudrillard were both focused on how language affects thought and builds our reality around us. But it does kind of bring up an important point. Given how the creature in the film works, with each cell its own unique thing with a equal survival mechanism built into every other cell, why isn't it called the Things? I mean, besides the fact that that would be very stupid. Granted, I don't think the average viewer would think of the creature in the plural sense, even though both Clarke and Macready describe it as a billion little cells, each with an individualized survival drive. Conceptually, the creature is one thing that happens to be able to separate itself from itself. And that means that every time it assimilates a new victim, it's draining them of their individual essence and adding them to a nebulous, indistinguishable mass. There is no individual, only the collective thing. This was the issue for Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno in Dialectic of Enlightenment. From the inside, the Enlightenment looked like a philosophical way to drive humanity towards utopia, or at least a better life. To Horkheimer and Adorno, its drive to dominate nature masked a dark underside of unreason and destruction. They argued that the Enlightenment claimed to liberate humanity from fear and myth through scientific calculation and the reduction of the physical world to a series of numbers and data points.
Gotta stay
And though it was supposed to make things better, the fully enlightened Earth radiates disaster triumphant. Yeah, I don't think Theodore and Max got invited to many cool parties. According to Horkheimer and Adorno, rationality, when wielded as an instrument for individual profit, reverts to the same mythic savagery and totalitarianism it sought to escape. They detested not only the savagery of the Nazi regime, but the American media's tendency to pacify its citizenry with vapid entertainment.
We're entered the back door.
If the thing replicates and assimilates us physically, the capitalist society of the Enlightenment assimilates us intellectually and emotionally.
The Transformers, each sold separately from Hasbro.
The assembly line didn't just streamline production, enabling us to create cars and refrigerators and television sets. It created an obligation to own a car, a refrigerator, and a television set, if you wanted to be part of society. And then the two-car garage, white picket fence, 2.3 kids, a dog named Spot, automatic washer, automatic dryer. For Horkheimer, but especially Adorno, each of these inventions represented the Enlightenment's drive to conquer, eliminating the charm of distance with cars and TVs, and delaying the natural decay of fresh food were mankind's way of imposing our will on the natural world. Outpost 31 is practically a monument to this Enlightenment rationality. It represents man's unyielding desire to conquer nature through exploration. The South Pole is an area that practically screams, "Humans don't belong here." But the men use generators, helicopters, complex communication arrays, and computers to modify the terrain to allow them to survive. And yet, when confronted with the irrationality of the shape-shifting thing, their technology and reason spectacularly fail.
You gotta be fucking kidding.
Their descent from enlightened scientific objectivity to primal mythic violence is swift. As researchers, they initially rely on established scientific paradigms to identify and neutralize the threat. They perform autopsies. They analyze tissue samples. They run simulations. Dr. Copper and Blair try to categorize the alien using traditional biology. After all that, they find themselves hopelessly, hilariously impotent. Blair finally gives up terrestrial classification, stating with exhaustion,
I don't know who to trust.
Blair, who is arguably the man who depends most on rationality, is the first to abandon it when he realizes what has been revealed. He destroys the equipment that will get them off the base and shoots at anyone who tries to stop him. 20 minutes of screen time later, and MacReady has staged a revolution, turning the reasonably egalitarian enlightened outpost into a strong-armed dictatorship. The men have descended back into barbarism, with a chieftain ruling through absolute violence and terror. By the time MacReady has them strapped down to a couch and reduced to subjects for study, the men are already treating each other as things. They are data points to be verified or purged, not human beings. This is the fulfillment of Horkheimer and Adorno's dialectic of enlightenment. The pursuit of pure scientific survival and mastery over nature has led to paranoid, totalitarian destruction. And despite their rationalist values, they revert to a primal state of war, of all against all. The creature buried in the Antarctic ice is such a massive and bizarre problem that it completely destroys everything we know about human science long before it destroys the base. And that is, somehow, a worse problem for the men than the alien that is trying to kill them. Science philosopher Thomas Kuhn challenged the idea that science is something that just linearly progresses through a steady cumulative acquisition of objective facts. Instead, he argued that science operates within a series of established paradigms, or rigid frameworks of accepted practices, theories, assumptions, methodologies.
And he disproved that theory, making Aristotle and everybody else on Earth look like a bitch.
There is a period of what we might consider normal science at the beginning of the film. Blair, Fuchs, and Copper approach the problem with the standard tools: autopsies, microscopes, chemical analyses. They are trying to find where this anomaly of a creature fits into the existing biological framework. And as long as that framework holds, the community functions. But the creature is part siphonophore, part plasmodial slime, part dinoflagellate, and part sponge. And yet none of those things will make your coworker's head sprout spider legs and scurry out of the room. In this case, the anomaly continues to persist while the framework crumbles around it.
Bitch. Bitch. Bitch.
But we shouldn't underestimate just how powerful the pull of the existing paradigm is. Our social hierarchies are tied to the same set of assumptions as our science is. And if the science goes, it kind of all gets called into question, right?
What the hell are you looking at me like that for?
I don't know.
That's why a half hour after Blair gives his analysis about the anomaly that the thing represents, the base leader is a prisoner on the couch and the helicopter pilot is doing scientific experiments. Consider how the real story of the thing begins. The men witness a man in a helicopter chasing a dog and shooting at it. Their first inclination is that he's gone stir crazy. What else could possess a man to act this way? Blair is the first to figure out what the thing is and what it wants, so he violently destroys the equipment and communication systems that could get them home. The other men have to team up to subdue him and lock him in the makeshift equivalent of a padded room. And that's because their immediate assumption is that Blair has gone crazy. What else could possess a man to act this way? And during the last half of the second act, the men suspect Macready of being the thing, and then suspect him of being a madman, largely based on the fact that he was defending his life because they suspected he was the thing. What else could possess a man to act this way? Every step of the way, the capital M myth of scientific rationality holds, and the honestly very human reaction of fear, anger, and distress in the face of new knowledge appears as irrationality. The other guy is always crazy until the other guy is naive. Kuhn called this incommensurability, the notion that people working under two different frameworks for understanding the world will not be able to communicate fully. This is why the final scene between Macready and Childs is so bleak. The blueprint for how we understand human is out the window. The concept of sanity is irrelevant. Neither is able to prove their humanity to the other. The grounding force of their shared language has vanished. When Blair breaks down and sabotages the camp, it's the psychological manifestation of a Kuhnian crisis. A computer simulation shows that if the thing were to get out, humanity would likely be wiped out in 3 years. Like Ripley in Alien, he is most concerned with quarantine, but like Macready later in the film, he makes the decision unilaterally. There's no more egalitarian democracy, no council of elders, no discussion about the best way to move forward. People can't be trusted. One man, with a unique knowledge of the way that the world actually works, has to make the rules for everyone's good. Do you want fascism? Because that's how you get fascism. The final straw for all the men is Macready's blood test, which is fine from an experimental design standpoint, but exhibits, in the words of Stephen King, frostbite of the brain. Like Alfred Nobel and Robert Oppenheimer before him, Macready forgets to ask the most pressing question before his blood experiment. And then what? Building off the work of Sigmund Freud,
it's me, bitches!
Literary and psychoanalytic critic Robin Wood coined the term the return of the repressed. Thankfully, the idea is fairly simple and intuitive, and we see it rooted in all sorts of psychological and biological sciences. If you repress something significant for long enough, it will start to leak out in your behavior and your thought patterns. If you try to maintain a poker face with a four of a kind, you start tapping your foot. In the case of the thing, it's a sudden violent eruption that breaks through our conscious normality and civilized behavior. When we first meet the men, they're bored. Hella bored. They've repressed emotion, sexuality, and their instincts in order to do the job. And there's this palpable sense that it's wearing on them. There's only so much ping pong and computer chess you can play before you go.
Checkmate. Checkmate.
Wake up, take a measurement, drink until you fall asleep. Wake up, take a measurement, drink until you fall asleep. Repeat for months on end. It's not an environment designed for men to thrive. It's a place where men alter their surroundings just to survive, wearing layer upon layer, even when they're inside. Any piece of exposed flesh could fall victim to the elements. And yet, here is a creature who is all flesh, nothing but flesh, exposed, visceral, blood and sinew. When Dr. Copper tries to use the defibrillator on the Norris thing, trying to use human technology to impose on the natural world, the eruption is violent and deadly.
Clear!
Clear.
The same thing happens with Macready's blood experiment.
We'll do you last.
Every attempt to squeeze nature into a bottle just results in the bottle getting broken and everyone's hands getting sliced all to hell. Freud wrote about thanatos, an unconscious psychological desire to return to an inorganic, undifferentiated, and conflict-free state. Something that might, loosely translated, be called a death drive. Carpenter's narrative is practically dripping with this concept. Life is exhausting at the outpost. Even if In fact, especially if nothing is happening. Just being a person with unique problems and feeling isolated in those problems is exhausting. And this was recognized in Freud's time. Think of it this way. These men have sacrificed their time, effort, health, and who knows what else to travel to a hostile environment for the betterment of all mankind. But what happens if something lands in your backyard that negates everything you know about the world? What was that cost and that sacrifice for? By absorbing them in, the thing turns them from individual, conflicting organisms into a single, indistinguishable biomass. Gone is their individuality, basically granting them the oblivion of the death drive.
We're not getting out of here alive.
We see this drive when Macready checks on Blair and finds that he's fashioned a noose in anticipation of ending it all. Or at least in an attempt to convince Macready that he was going to end it all if they don't let him rejoin the group.
I don't want to stay out here anymore. I want to come back inside.
By the end, Macready and Childs have basically agreed to let the cold take them. Embracing death is the ultimate solution to the infection of life. I can't say this section is more cheerful than the previous one, but at least it's a lot easier to wrap your head around. It's really easy to see the film's historical context when you compare it to the mid-1950s version. The first film acts like a piece of black felt that you put behind a diamond to examine it. In the 1950s, we were just coming off the Second World War, where the US military had saved the world from evil, so the story goes, and fuzzy-brain scientists had opened the door to a possible self-induced extinction-level event. It's no wonder, then, that the film is so paternalistic about the scientists' characters.
Sorry, Professor, we're not going to melt it or chip it. Eddie, open that window, will you?
You mean we're not allowed to examine it, to investigate
just that,
whether
Doctor. This is stupid.
the scientists?
The film is in black and white, both aesthetically and in its framing. Robert Cornthwaite's Dr. Carrington is immediately pegged as a problem when he meets square-jawed buckaroo Kenneth Tobey, who might as well have just sauntered in with a vibranium shield and a star on his chest. But that's how these scientists are. Good with an Erlenmeyer flask, but not so good with people. And they definitely don't know how to keep a lady warm at night. That's square-jawed buckaroo Kenneth Tobey's job. And business is booming.
Well,
Contrast this with 1982's The Thing, which takes place 30 years later, after a civil rights movement, Vietnam, Watergate, stagflation, a spike in crime, and the sword of Damocles that was the Cold War hanging just overhead for the audience's entire adult life.
You may be in your schoolyard playing when the signal comes. That signal means to stop whatever you are doing and get to the nearest safe place fast. Always remember, a flash of an atomic bomb can come at any time, no matter where you may be.
While The Thing from Another World lionizes the American military, Carpenter's version doesn't even bother with them. Gary, the station manager played by Donald Moffat, is listed in the script as ex-Army, but that's about it. He seems more like a middle management operations guy than a soldier. If the script instead listed him as ex-Kinko's regional manager, I would have found it equally fitting.
I guess you'll all feel a little easier if somebody else was in charge.
The Outpost doesn't even have a woman for hippie-coiffed burly man Kurt Russell to keep warm at night, unless you count the voice of the chess computer. But they still find a way to work in a little light misogyny, so don't worry if you were lacking.
Cheating bitch.
No, Carpenter's movie isn't sociological or necessarily political, at least not as overtly as The Thing from Another World. This movie is psychological and philosophical. The paranoia of the characters reflects a society where the enemy is no longer so clearly defined. Post-Nixon, post the JFK assassination, and the assassination of RFK, and the assassination of Martin Luther King, and the assassination of Medgar Evers, and the assassination of Malcolm X, and well, you get the idea. Post all of that, people didn't feel like the threat was separated by a geographic boundary anymore.
I told you, somebody's trying to kill me.
Oh, Jesus.
Yes, the Iron Curtain and the Soviet Union were still out there, but it seemed like the enemy had seeped into every facet of our infrastructure, every facet of our social fabric. The internal cancer can't be cut out by the military because cancer is made of us. Instead, you have to monitor individual parts of the body and individual cells like a hawk. You have to turn the surveillance that used to be pointed at Moscow onto Boise, Idaho. This was a concept deeply entrenched in the heart of the work of Michel Foucault. Foucault's analysis of power, discipline, and punish explores how modern societies control individuals, not through traditional violence, but through the normalization of surveillance and disciplinary power. Foucault thought about Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, a concept I've explored multiple times on the channel in more depth. But to move us along, the panopticon is a prison in which the inmates believe that they are constantly being watched, even though they can't see their observers. Basically, if I see a guard looking at me, I know I can't get away with anything. And if the guard looks the other way, I know I can get away with something. But if the guard is invisible, I never know if the guard is watching me or looking the other way. In fact, I don't even know if there is a guard. And finding out by testing it would lead to harsh physical consequences if I get it wrong. And the great thing is, if you use harsh physical consequences on random people, instead of just the guy who tried to escape, the prisoners kind of start to police themselves, out of fear that they could be next. The infiltration of the Thing turns the camp into a panopticon. The Thing isn't so much invisible as hiding in plain sight. The men know that they're being watched, but they can't figure out by whom. This forces the men, or rather invites them, to establish a strict disciplinary regime where your movements are monitored, your food is prescribed, and your time is clocked. All this under the threat of death by Macready.
Any of them move, you fry them. You hear anything at all, you cut loose on the sirens.
Any lapse in view from the other men could result in assimilation, but any lapse in obeying the rules could get you burned to a crisp by Macready's flamethrower. Foucault argued, though, that power isn't monolithic. It's not held exclusively by one group or individual. It's complex. It's constructed by our social interactions. The blood test is the ultimate weaponization of Foucault's gaze as a tool of state-run terror. The men are physically bound to the couches, stripped of their autonomy, and subjected to coerced body examination to determine whether they're human or alien. What fails in the Thing is that, while paranoia can lead to more caution, the system of power itself is contaminated from within.
Somebody blew out a fuse in the lab. Lights were out in there for an hour. Any one of us could have gotten to him.
Antonio Gramsci was famous for saying, among other things, that dominant groups maintain their strongest control not through physical or coercive means, but by winning the consent of the subordinate masses through shared ideology. In other words, when powerful elites convince you that paying more in taxes or building data centers in your backyard were your ideas, that you decided on for your benefit, the less likely you are to bust out the guillotine. The thing about that, though, is that some people are always going to identify as a problem. Very few decisions are decided with a 100% consensus. That means that there will always be a struggle between the yays and the nays. Woo! And this isn't even confined to the big decisions. Power is constantly being renegotiated, challenged, and sometimes lost. There is, in Gramsci's words, a site of struggle, a place where ideological battles take place. And it's not in the lecture halls of a university or in the chambers of a legislature. It's in the everyday decisions that we make about how we're going to live our lives and the power that we have to do so. At the beginning of the story, station manager Gary holds undisputed power. He represents that traditional militaristic and bureaucratic authority that square-jawed buckaroo Kenneth Tobey did in the original film. He's the only one that carries a gun. He relies on regulations. As the crisis deepens, though, the threat of the Thing renders traditional bureaucratic authority useless. If Gary represents the same military authoritarianism that Captain Hendry did, then John Carpenter's film tells us that Hendry might have been a fine leader for kids who traded bubblegum baseball cards and had little propellers on their beanies, but he'd fall apart when the enemy couldn't be mowed down on the battlefield. The difference is between a pre-Vietnam and a post-Vietnam view of the American military apparatus. By 1982, a lot of the luster was gone from American military might, and it wouldn't really recover until Desert Storm 9 years later. When the blood plasma is discovered to be sabotaged, all eyes look to Gary because he's the keeper of the key. When the other men say, "What if Gary is the problem?" it's like saying, "What if our view of the American military is the problem? Maybe we don't need to send our soldiers to every tiny foreign nation in a show of strength, because the rot is coming from inside the house." When Macready takes over, it's like a form of fascistic technocracy. "We're gonna science the shit out of this, and if you don't agree, I'll shoot you in the head or torch you while you're tied to the couch." I think a lot of viewers might come away with the idea that Macready is the hero in this case. That's certainly the case with Kurt Russell, who happens to be the biggest star and our point of view protagonist. But none of Macready's ideas turn out any better than the other guys. Carpenter doesn't have much faith in bomb-throwing radicals either. The bottom line for Carpenter is that civil discourse has failed, the social contract is voided, and power is maintained at the end of a gun, or the nozzle of a flamethrower. Hey, what are the guys at the outpost studying anyway? It's a research outpost. There's scientific equipment there. There are experts in biology, geophysics, and meteorology, all of which makes sense. But the audience never really gets a sense of what they're doing there. The screenplay is kind enough to explain it for us, sort of. They're gathering data concerning the physical and natural sciences. But of course they are. They're scientists. The actual movie relies on us just assuming science man stuff, and not harping on it. Science men do science things, what? Herbert Marcuse was perhaps one of the harshest critics of the Enlightenment as it was manifesting in capitalist society. Marcuse argued that modern society, driven by technology, forces people into a single way of life. They are controlled by consumerism and lose the ability to think critically or independently. This alienates them from their work, their environment, their needs, and each other. The Enlightenment, Marcuse implicitly argues, created the tools for its own destruction. The men of Station 4 are alienated, one-dimensional subjects, isolated cogs in a massive military, scientific, industrial complex called the U.S. Antarctic Research Program. Before the creature even arrives, the camp is characterized by boredom, self-medication, antisocial behavior, and subtle hostility.
Cheating bitch.
MacReady rage quits and destroys his computer in a move that presages destroying the camp when he loses on a bigger scale. Childs is watching old game shows. Palmer is smoking weed and reading comics. These are all behaviors of pacified men who have been crushed into a one-dimensional society. They consume to cope with the emptiness of their existence. They are so task-driven that they don't even get to know their colleagues, the ones that they're holed up with for months on end, on a personal level. Psychologist Daniel Simons famously studied task orientation's effect on change blindness, which is our ability to notice differences in our environment. What he found is that nearly 50% of us have trouble differentiating between people we've been interacting with only a foot away from us when we're focused on the task rather than the person. The people we interact with become interchangeable. And if you aggregate that into a world where you're interacting with dozens, if not hundreds of strangers on a daily basis, like if you work in a call center, or you're an insurance claims adjuster, or a soldier, or a scientist, or a YouTuber, people just start to blend together. Ask yourself this: is the thing really good at mimicking every aspect of its victim's physicality and personality? Or are these guys just bad at telling the difference because they haven't paid attention to one another? It is, of course, okay to enjoy John Carpenter's The Thing purely on a surface, visceral level. The director's trademark visual touches, the claustrophobia of the setting, the fantastic performances, and the groundbreaking work of Rob Bottin are all good enough reasons to curl up on the couch for a night with some popcorn. But to do so is to ignore Carpenter's sustained engagement with the deepest theoretical crisis of the 20th century. A film can be both an unnerving descent into paranoia on the surface and an exploration for why that paranoia feels so ingrained in our collective psyche. It's a critique of the Enlightenment Project and of our modern condition. The intruder that infiltrates Station 4 rips through our way of understanding the core truths of our world, and in doing so, shatters the way we relate to one another, and as a result, destroys the power systems we've erected for solving problems. The horror, for which Carpenter gives no respite except for a title card at the end of the madness, doesn't just come from death and destruction. It comes from the realization that our identities are far less stable than we assume. It leaves the viewer sitting alongside MacReady and Childs, completely stripped of our ideological illusions, scientific certainty, and the comforting myth of human exceptionalism. Without hyperbole, it's a monumental work of cinematic critical theory, an enduring testament to the anxieties of an era where humanity realized the most terrifying other might simply be a perfect, soulless reflection of ourselves. Stay cool, stay safe, wash your hands, return your shopping carts, watch Clark, make good choices, and I'll see you next time.